Hello and welcome to another video. In this video we'll be covering a tier list for 8v8. This is mostly in mind of solo play because group gameplay is too heavily influenced by player skill. So this is also kind of similar to what you'll see in group gameplay, but do keep in mind a lot of these specs can perform a lot better in group scenarios. There is a mixture of reasons for each spec's placement, which I will explain with timestamps if you're curious about them. If not, in the description there's an image of the completed tier list if you would rather just skip to see that. Anyway, on to the reasonings for each placement. Advanced Prototype, S tier. This is also Tactics Vanguard. Its burst is unmatched, power yield is one of the best defensives in the game, energy shield with cooldown reduction is incredibly good. It's mostly yellow damage with great range. Taunt stun is disgusting control, and it's pretty much impossible to outplay, so there is really a lack of counterplay for it. It has the best hydraulics, as BT gets the extra movement speed on hydraulics. And it also has Carbonize. This spec puts quite a large gap between other specs when played well. It's incredibly easy to pick up and isn't too difficult to attempt to master. There is a reason almost anyone can play this as an alt without too much trouble due to its very straightforward kit. The hardest part of the spec is defensive management and heat management, even though it has a decent amount of forgiveness compared to other specs. Lethality Operative, S tier. This is also Ruffian Scoundrel. It has incredible durability. It has 30% dot DR, has 20% damage reduction from Revitalizer, has 15% damage reduction from Shield Probe. This I think is going to be Shield Scan. Sorry, I don't exactly remember the exact name. Then you can also take 20% damage reduction from Corrosive Grenade, but obviously you will have to build that up. It's not incredibly hard to do because you can just spam it over and over. Damage reduction is the best form of durability in the current state of the game. It has very strong sustain and AoE, mostly yellow damage. Viral Elements is the real tank killer and huge AoE pressure. You can take both of its CCs without having to give up much. The spec is very hard to flat out kill when played well. It has a lot of healing to pair with its unmatched damage reduction available. It's also a rather simple spec to play when it comes to doing damage. It can also off-heal pretty efficiently compared to all the other off-healing specs in the game. The hardest part of this spec is mobility and positioning. It's the most forgiving spec in the game to play. Immortal Juggernaut, S tier. This is also Defense Guardian. It has incredible CC, the best AoE mez in the game. Damage reduction you can apply to its allies via Seed. It has amazing baseline defensives, the strongest burst of all tanks, and the hardest hitting. It also has CC immunity tied to its leap. This spec is a bully and there's no other way to put it. It can control a player like no other spec in the game and is leagues above the other tank specs. It can also deny some specs from really being able to play when played well. It isn't a situational tank and doesn't have to take tank implants to gain durability. It is also rather easy to play, though the tanking aspect isn't as easy to be proficient. It's also incredibly forgiving. Rage Juggernaut, A tier. This is also Focus Guardian. Very strong burst and sustain. It has CC immunity, also has healing defensives, good mobility, and decent control. This spec is straightforward like the others. Its damage is rather high in general, but isn't quite as durable as top tier options. Its mobility and evades can definitely help with the durability issue, which is why it's ranked as high as it is. Its damage is also applicable in all kinds of games and isn't reliant on situational games, since its durability is more in question compared to the other specs. It will definitely take some finesse to play effectively in some situations. In games where there's a lot of range matches with S tier specs, it will feel worse, hence its A tier ranking. Do note the difference between S tier and A tier is quite big. Madness Sorcerer. This is also balanced Sage. Good sustain. Deathbrand isn't working as intended and gives incredible control sometimes. A large amount of internal damage. Mitigation stats don't work versus this. Good self-healing from doing damage. Amazing DR uptime. And it is ranged. This spec can face tank some of the lower tier specs, and that's just silly. It's incredibly easy to do damage on it, and the hardest part is positioning. To do optimal damage, you need to be able to constantly cast, so avoiding damage is much more valued, so it will take some map knowledge and finesse to fully see its potential. If some other specs had the same amount of DR or self-healing, they'd be S tier right now. The largest drawback is that most of its damage is over time or requires constant casting. Pyrotech Pyrotech, A tier. This is also Plasma Tech Vanguard. It has good sustain. It's the tankiest off-tank spec in the game. It has 30% dot DR, 30% Cold DR, 30-second power yield, energy shield. It does mostly elemental damage. Mitigation stats don't work versus this. It has Pyrotech Hydraulics, so it gains the extra movement speed. CC immunity on energy shield, which is very valuable. And cooldown reduction on Carbonize. Very good. This spec can bully melee rather easily. Carbonize is one of the best AoE CCs in the game, and getting a CDR for it really allows it to push leads in AoE situations. If the class doesn't have high armor penetration or incredible burst, it's incredibly hard to kill it fast. Its single target is still strong, but isn't bursty, at least not without explosive fuel. It's not great into a mostly range composition, and it won't be able to do damage as effectively into that. Vengeance Juggernaut, and this is also Vigilance Guardian, A tier. Has decent sustain, uncapped AoE potential, CC immunity, good control, decent self-healing in AoE situations. This spec will clear entire teams if you let it. Most players already know this, so you're usually not going to get away with it. It's very easy to play, its control is very good. It's ranked lower as it'll be easier to pin down than Rage, as it doesn't get an extra root break on Intercede like Rage does. It'll also be easier for most specs to get away from it when it's starting to do a lot of AoE, whereas Rage isn't focused on cleave at all to do well. Overall, one of the easiest specs to get into the game with if you like to play melee. Shieldtech Pyrotech. This is also Vanguard tank too. Can't remember the name of the spec. Forgive me. This is A tier. It's the best AoE tank. Has an insane implant for durability. Easily the best tank implant in the entire game. Its trauma is yellow damage, so therefore it becomes more reliable. Carbonize and Hydraulics. This spec is reliant on situational types of matches. It's incredible at creating cleave, if at all possible. It excels in cleave, and the majority of its damage is reliant on cleave. Most of its damage is yellow, making it the most reliable trauma in the game. Since it is so situational, sometimes there's games where the spec isn't ideal to be basically tanking on. It doesn't quite live up to Immortal standards, but it's not slacking anywhere near as much as Darkness. Its ranking is so high due to its reliability and incredible tank implant. Lightning Sorcerer, B tier. This is also Telekinetic Sage. Has the best root control in the entire game with elemental convection, some internal burst damage, which cannot be mitigated by tank stats, has incredible range, and has decent damage reduction. While it's not madness, it can really control teams with elemental convection and suppressive current, which is Lethality. A good lightning sorcerer can really turn tides in teamfights and make it quite hard for melee to sometimes play. During polarity, your damage window is incredibly strong. The main downside is a lack of good self-healing, along with some conflicting talents that you would want to take for survival over damage. This spec would earn higher if it had better self-healing, because it certainly has the damage depending on how you're playing. Carnage Marauder, which is also Concentration Sentinel, B tier, good mobility mostly due to predation, mixed damage profile, and it also has some decent range for melee. There's not much to say about Marauder specs because durability isn't their strong suit, and with the nerf of Defel Splice Genes, it's no longer in its own league of mobility. The spec does damage, and it's pretty much all it has outside of predation. Its durability doesn't quite compare to Rage or AP, nor does its damage, hence the ranking. Innovative Ordnance Mercenary, B tier. This is also Assault Specialist Commando. It has elemental damage, which negates mitigation tank stats. It has the hardest hitting dot in the game, which is often its highest damaging portion. Quite a lot of healing defensives, and it has Electronet. It's a bit harder for most to play, and it is important to use your auto attack on. Supercharged Gas Dot is also applied with an auto attack. The best perks is that it has mercenary defensives while having better damage than Arsenal. Innovative Ordnance can dish out quite a bit of AoE, but isn't as good as its peers that are more focused on such. It also doesn't quite burst as well as its peers, leaving it in the solid middle ground of a weird identity, in my opinion. Like Vengeance without the uncapped AoE potential. Hatred Assassin, B tier. This is also Serenity's Shadow. It has quite a bit of internal damage, which negates mitigation tank stats. It has okay mobility if you give up some durability to take those talents. It has strong sustain single target and AoE damage. It can pop off with kill resets. This one would easily be ranked higher if it wasn't so squishy. The spec would benefit the most nearly of any class if it was to receive the same damage reduction and or healing madness had. It'd easily be S tier even. Since its durability is lacking, it earns this ranking, and for mobility options, it's forced to give up some defensive power. It's great for a stealth daughter, but doesn't compare to its counterpart, Lethality. Bodyguard, B tier. This is also the healing spec for Commando. Unfortunately, I don't remember the name. Maybe Medtech. Some of the best defenses for a healer. Good burst healing, has net and hydraulics. This earns this tier and not higher, as heat management isn't as straightforward as it was in previous expansions in PvP. As the must take for vending some heat talent is not quite feasible to take all the time. While it is better than the other healers in some situations, it doesn't quite mean healers overall are doing great. And I think this is the proper position for the first healer to appear. 6.0 we gained a massive damage spike, nearly doubling our DPS, while healing in the past 2 expansion has barely gone up. This shows very easily in gameplay where against good DPS, healers can sometimes be ignored even if they are decent. Carnage Marauder and Combat Sentinel, C tier. Shards of Mortis allows it to hit 100% plus crit chance. Game breaking, I would say. Incredible movement, but immediately stopped by any type of control. Has 100% armor pent burst. Hinder via gore, CC immunity, and predation. This was a hard one to place as it has good damage and very high APM, making it quite a struggle to play at its fullest. It's lacking in durability and doesn't have the range nor extra defense chance offered to it by its built-in kit like the other spec does. For example, you have Root on Obliterate and Defense Chance on Fierce Strike for Fury. Carnage does not get this. It does get some damage reduction, but that damage reduction is barely noticeable. We also lost our ranged Root, so therefore it's a little bit harder to stay on target like it used to be. We used to also be able to afford taking Ravage Root. It's also primarily white damage, and over the past few expansions, white damage has been shoved out of the meta. It earns this ranking due to its peers lacking hard in other areas, while what's above it has so much more available. Arsenal Mercenary and Gunnery Commando, C tier. Good healing defensives, some nasty burst of 100% armor penetration, net, and hydraulics. Sadly, it's a good portion of white damage to do proper sustained damage on the spec, so it falls behind quite a bit. It also has a 5x damage amplification to its auto crit, while also reaching 100% armor penetration with it, allowing it to hit incredibly hard on almost anyone. This is most likely why it's not been buffed yet, as it could easily become a monster. Autocritical used to be on Heatseeker, and it would be far greater help if it was back on Heatseeker for starters. Engineering, Sniper, and SWTOR Gunslinger, I believe. C tier. It's the hardest hitting yellow damage burst in the game. Has decent control. It's a good melee controller. Evasion, at least kind of. Operative's evasion ends up being better, and the reason why I say this is that you get evasion for only 3 seconds on Sniper. It does give you 200% damage reduction for the duration, however, the 200% damage reduction doesn't actually work completely right for some reason. So there are some things that will completely negate that damage reduction almost altogether. For example, Energy Burst, which is definitely one of the classes that you already don't do too well against. You have God Roll, Diversion, and you can run fast, I guess. There's not much to say about this other than it brings some damage and control. It's got the highest hitting yellow damage burst in the game, but it doesn't quite make up for the areas that it lacks it. It's also not quite the easiest to form on, so it often gets overlooked and outshined by its peers. If it had better durability, it would be easily a monster. Sniper has a unique issue at the moment where it can do damage, it just doesn't have the defensive kit to really apply that. Concealment Operative and Scrapper Scoundrel, C tier. Second highest hitting yellow damage burst, has decent control, evasion, and God Roll. While I could say this is better, it's hard to recommend as it's harder to play defensively. In the hands of an experienced player, it'll look better, but it's more than likely there's quite a large skill gap between the person playing it and the people that he's playing. It's very easy to lock down operatives with roots into stuns. Sadly, most still haven't caught on to this in the past 11 years. Without having revitalizers anymore, it's very prone to being chunked down and forced out of the fight unless they're okay with flat out dying. Its defensive kit is more centered around immunity and mobility. Medicine Operative and Sawbones Scoundrel, C tier. Good AoE healing and sustain. It has stealth, I suppose. It's a little bit less reliant on channeling and also has evasion. There's not much to say about the spec anymore as it's lost its main source of damage reduction, leaving it quite vulnerable like other healers. However, evasion is quite useless if you get stunned, unlike suppression, phase walk, or reflect. Its output is some of the highest as a trade-off, but its durability is reliant on the ability to self-heal. If it was to gain strong damage reduction again from something like Revitalizer, it'd easily earn way higher. I think this is the proper placement for the second healer in this list. Corruption Sorcerer and Seer Sage, I believe. C tier. Some AoE, decent sustain, has pull, has phase walk, and God Bubble. Some defensive power, far less than Mercenary, but more than Medicine, as DR is more valuable. The spec lost reduced damage on its hard stun and damage reduction on pull, so its utility has dropped. It also has some of the worst implant choices of all three healers. It is easier to pick up in comparison and is completely playable. It did gain 9% damage reduction talent, which is something, but not quite anything as strong as Mercenary. Healers don't quite want to be up in the fight and get hit all the time like Mercenary can be, at least sometimes. So the effectiveness is definitely not as good. It's hard to place this and Medicine, but I think if Medicine was to gain damage reduction, again, it would be immediately shot up quite far, even maybe into A tier. While Sorcerer kind of needs a little bit more than just that. Virulence Sniper and Dirty Fighting Gunslinger, D tier. It has some control, diversion, evasion, which is worse than operatives. I explain this in engineering. Please definitely check that if you want more explanation on that. It has God Roll and a mixed damage profile, just like engineering. However, it's a little bit more reliant on white damage. The spec is lacking defensively, but could easily rise up if it was to get a better defensive kit, just like engineering. The main issue holding this spec back damage-wise is in some matches is the reliance on white damage. Its burst can be completely negated if high defense chance is present, for example, predation being constantly used and a lot of sorcerers or defense chance defensives show up. Damage is its main way to self-peel. When it can't really do that, it has no choice but to run away or be a sitting duck, hence the ranking. Deception Assassin and Infiltration Shadow, D tier, has some decent control. Damage reduction talent is actually good, strong burst, and it is stealth. Even with the damage reduction talent, you still feel lacking defensive power compared to other specs. Along with that, you miss out on damage for taking said talent. Even if all damage options, you don't quite reach the burst of other specs like Rage and AP. Its mobility choices forces you to give up very useful things in your tree. It would earn a higher ranking, but most specs not only outperform this one in damage, but also deal with taking damage a lot better. Its best thing it had to offer was control, and pruning took some of that away. It either needs to regain that or gain a better tree selection. While it can do a lot right now, it is situational and excels where there are no tanks or other powerful meta classes preventing them from playing. Darkness Assassin and Kinetic Combat Shadow, D tier. It has some control. Shroud to allies is incredible if you can actually afford to use it. It is stealth. Why is the final tank this low? Well, some DPS classes can maintain better damage reduction than this tank, which is flat out wrong. Damage mitigation stats don't really work against a lot of the meta damage going out nowadays, and Shroud is only 3 seconds now instead of 5 seconds that it should be. Its main damage passive was pruned from it and made a choice for seemingly no reason at all when no other tank had this happen to them. It also has to choose Spike to gain 10% damage reduction after using it for only 6 seconds, as it does lack damage reduction quite hard in comparison to its peers, even DPS. The spec could be rather strong with the right changes, but they need to be PvP specific, as this class has a lot of mitigation that often ends up being completely useless in PvP. Its damage is also failing in comparison, and Depredating Volts is really showing its age as it's the only channel ability left in game outside of the re-added Flamethrower and Deadly Onslaught. There's a lot that can be done to make it better. It earns this ranking because nothing has been done. Annihilation Marauder and Watchman Sentinel, D tier. It has some HPS, I guess. It also has predation. Its sustain is like okay, I guess. The best thing it brings to the table is HPS. If it can maintain uptime as its peers, just do almost everything better. After last nerf, it made it so this class has almost no burst whatsoever. Of course, some say not everything needs burst, and I would agree, but this type of damage profile isn't quite as applicable in PvP, and it shows drastically. something as simple as making Annihilation auto crit after dual saber throw, like Dispatcher's implant, would give the spec the ability to pack a punch again. But it doesn't quite cover the issues with Force Rend ever since 2.0. When Rend was introduced and then got put on a cooldown, it became very awkward, or it became a very awkward dot focus spec, gradually with less focus on Rupture, Ravage, and dual saber throw. Force Rend has only 2 real chances to spread if you have perfect uptime, and is a good portion of your AoE. It is very easy to play against. The spec probably has the most confusing identity of all current specs, and doesn't need help as most of its damage can be completely negated by a good timed evasion. And the final one, Marksmanship Sniper and Sharpshooter Gunslinger D tier. Now, I would definitely put this above Annihilation. The only reason I didn't is because at the very least you get some HPS, and its sustained damage on Annihilation isn't terrible. There are a lot of situations where Marksmanship would just be more useful, but overall, if you wanted to talk about which one is going to be more of a liability in a more competitive match, it's going to be Marksmanship Sniper. It's not going to be Annihilation. So, what does Marksmanship bring? It has a big ambush if you take roll ambush, and even if you don't take it, it still hits pretty hard. It has God roll. It has decent control, and AoE pen rounds with root is pretty obnoxious, not gonna lie. It has diversion, and obviously evasion, which is, again, worse than operatives. And it has CC immunity with good uptime. And we've made it to the end. Why is Marksmanship here? Well, it's almost all white damage, meaning defense chance completely pushes them out. The main offenders that make it harder for snipers to play are assassins and marauders, which both have defense chance defensives, making it quite impossible for them to self-peel. Mobility and CC immunity is the best it has to offer outside diversion, but is very prone to situation games where there's less defense chance defensive users. It earns its ranking, and you may see now why white damage isn't too great in the current meta. Now for the close notes, all these classes are playable to varying degrees of success, and some games are just situational. Sometimes you may never get hit, and any of these classes can do a lot of damage if they get to play. Since damage is so high, everything can do well and perform in the right situations. Some will just do better than others, including player skill as an influence too. In the end, if you're a new player, the must plays in my book are this: Vengeance, Lethality, Madness, Hatred, and Rage. Everything else is alright, but I think these specs currently are in some of the most interesting states they've ever been in. For example, Hatred's new playstyle that I use is incredibly fun and rewarding if you can get a kill. Rage flow feels better than ever and now has the damage to truly back it up. Madness is flat out broken in a few ways. Deathbrand retriggers and applies a slow that's so drastic most melee can't even play the game if it happens. Lethality has everything you could ever want outside of taunts. And finally, Vengeance is an AoE lover's dream. Uncapped, cleave with self-healing to come with it to reward you for cleaving. Now, I know some people will probably not agree with this list, and that's totally fine. Just do keep in mind that this is for, again, solo play for 8v8. Group gameplay, as I said, will make this list too inconsistent and too reliant on player skill, so I can't accurately rank them because of that. So do take that with a grain of salt. As for my personal experience, I've played pretty much everything except for Marksmanship so far, and I believe IO, and also the healers. I'm not too interested in healing, but I pretty much played everything else. So that is my personal experience. Obviously, I've seen people and I've played against these classes a lot. I've played quite a bit of rigs. I've played tons of solo ranked. I've played tons of group ranked. So I would say, at least a little bit more experienced player than most. Anyway, if you guys have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments, as I will be more than happy to help. I appreciate you guys for watching. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day.